Last week we were talking, we were talking about the Olympics and the comparison where Sjord Van Taunen talks about he mentioned the Beijing Olympic opening ceremony. And
Yeah.
then we were talking in the thing about how different was the French Olympic opening ceremony. Like it was really
I,
disjointed and people all over the place. The parade actually on the river. And then, like the day after the reading, I saw this meme, like the Virgin French Olympic opening ceremony and the Chad Beijing Olympic opening ceremony. Like the very next day,
oh
bang.
my god. I haven't watched it yet. I've only seen the memes where the people are like freaking out. But yeah, I did see that commentary though that it was, very disjointed, very mannerist.
Yeah,
Mm.
so I did start thinking of that question: was the French Olympic opening ceremony Mannerist? And because at first when you posited the question, I had no idea um, how to think of it, and I'd say yes now. I don't know, like just there. I don't know if you've seen the one performance of the blue man on the salad, just doing all these weird movements and dancing around on the salad. But
Was that Tom Hanks? Because that's the joke going around.
I
Who
have
was that actor?
I have no idea. Um,
Michael
He was
Bay.
supposed to be Dionysus.
Yeah, a lot of people have been freaking out thinking they've been mocking the Bible apparently, but it was just, Bacchus and like one of those celebrations. I forget what they're called.
Oh,
Mm.
I'll mock the Bible. I don't give a fuck. Just kidding.
I mean, there was like a lot of like
Snap jump.
artificial, like focus on style, and maybe like artificialness. Like one of the main focuses was all the famous people at the French Olympic thing versus the Beijing Olympics, is more focused on like Chinese culture, um,
Mm.
or
And there were
usually,
no celebrities in the Chinese one.
yeah, yeah.
I think
There
it's
was
funny.
Well, this one had Gaga singing in French. And everyone loved the mechanical horse, like going across the water. And that's
Could
like something beyond nature. And like that's actually kind of a very French cultural thing, like the marionette, the puppet, and
yeah.
The French were always pretty good at science, like in developing things,
Yeah, so there's something like
like
complex
mechanical
and
things in that way. Yeah.
there's something elegant in having something like just thinking of Lady Gaga alone. There's a lot of really weird um, ways that she'll usually go about moving. I didn't see the Lady Gaga performance, but in like her music videos, she's usually moving around in very weird ways. There's themes of elegance and refinement and emotional intensity, and there's a lot of like intellectual playfulness that aligns with mannerism. So I'm gonna say yes. I'm gonna say
Is
it was mannerist.
is is Marie Antoinette being beheaded considered a part of French culture?
Yes. And I was
Oh yeah,
just thinking,
big
just
time.
that before you said that, what if they had a guillotine on a boat, like
Yeah,
going up the
yeah,
river?
that'd be funny. And like beheaded a puppet of her.
Peak mannerism.
Peak mannerism for real. Now that would be Chad France. It's funny
Like they
because
put
like
the head on one building,
yeah, it's funny because like
all spread out. The guillotine's on one building, the body's on another, and the head's on
uh,
another.
that's mannerist as fuck. It's funny because like there was a bunch of sabotages of the electrical infrastructure of France. Like when was like a day before, like a couple of days before the Olympics, like planned.
The very day before, yeah.
Yeah. Didn't really have any effect, but
I like the shit protest better.
That could be a part of the mannerism of the ceremony, the rejection
I
of the
know.
traditional.
But it was super funny to me. That was like, I love the way there was a timer too online that like geolocated you where you were on the sand.
Yeah,
You would know the exact time to take a shit.
yeah. If you couldn't make it,
Fantastic.
yeah. Oh.
That's what the internet's for.
And because of the rain at the opening ceremony, the next day they couldn't do the triathlon using the Seine because the levels of raw sewage washed into it were too high. So they had to wait for it to go down.
To reach
And
acceptable
then,
levels.
like a few days later, they were finally able to do the women's triathlon. And all the athletes had to take antibiotics, and some of them got sick in the
That's
days
such a-
after the
It's such a
swim.
French
So
move. Like, it was like right before the pandemic. I don't know if you, I mean, Jay, you're over there in Europe, so maybe you remember this. But
yeah,
like right before the pandemic, there was this big push in France to outlaw like facial coverings. And they were like, yeah, we need to do this for, all of these reasons. Like just complete made up bullshit to make them not seem xenophobic or like they were targeting Islamic people. And then, like out of nowhere, came a fucking pandemic. And then they had to like force facial coverings on everyone. And then they used many of the same arguments that they just used to ban them, that they said were reasons to ban them to like make them, this permanent fixture in public society for at least, foreseeable future. And like, I just could not help but laugh and then get really frustrated because like, that was bananas. And
yeah.
nobody's been able to swim in the Seine for like, what, like 150 years, if not more, because they just die. And then the Olympics come, they're like, oh, well, you should swim because it's so iconic. Yeah, iconic for smelling like shit. Like,
Well,
I would
what
be
they
down to
did
swim
is they
shit.
still interesting historic fact. But Paris, along with Liverpool, was one of the first countries, well, first cities in the world, should I say, to put in modern sewage systems to remove the wastewater. And what it is, when it rains very heavily, the reservoirs where it sort of kind of can store up in kind of vats or sort of holding tanks as it's going down the pipes. And then if it rains very heavily, these get flooded and then the shit washes into the river. So they tried to put in all these pumps and things so that when it rained like this, it would move all the water away so that it didn't flow into the Seine. And unfortunately, it wasn't enough, as they discovered. Yeah,
I would love to get
during the
gonorrhea.
opening ceremony.
this is why I subscribe for these facts. J facts.
Anyone down to
Yeah, let's
start?
read.
I think Jay wanted to read.
So, Deleuze and Guattari, major and minor usages. It goes without saying that the prevalence of manner over essence or practice over identity is by no means restricted to a single historical age. Neither is it restricted to art. Mannerism merely brings into experience a becoming that otherwise remains implicit, or generally forgotten and easily denied. But in this way, it does afford a new perspective from which old problems can be revisited. For example, it reveals that traditional stylistics, as part of rhetoric, is fundamentally essentialist. Not only does it subordinate style to content, signification, signification, should I say, it relates style to the organic play of identity and variation. From Aristotle to Leo Spitzer, Michael Rifatieri, and Umberto Eco, stylistics has defined style by the way a text deviates from an invariant general rule. It is the study of practical deviation. Yet precisely because it is bound to the general, it always explains practice through its likeness to something else, and hence subsumes a style's particularity under the extension of a wider concept or determining analogy. Because of this incorporation, classical stylistics may never have had much to do with style. Contrary to stylistics, modern linguistics seeks to extract rules from language. Yet it is precisely the distinction between particular deviation and general rule that Deleuze contests. For example, he denies Ferdinand de Saussure's classic distinction of the grammaticality of written language and the agrammaticality of the spoken word, and instead proposes a generalized stylistics or pragmatics that denies Longhi any reality and accepts only parole. A writer knows well that a language is a system of imbalance, so that there is no difference between a level of Longhi or long and a level of parole. Language is made up of all sorts of heterogeneous currents in a state of multiple disequilibrium. Similarly, in A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari hold against Noam Chomsky that there are no universals of human language that enable us to define it as a homogeneous system. Instead, the humanist concept of varietas, eclecticism, taken from Ciceronian rhetoric, offers a better model. All languages are in imminent continuous variation. A language is a dynamic system that is always far from equilibrium and in perpetual bifurcation, meaning that there is always another language in every language ad infinitum. Around each actual determination of a linguistic relation, phonological, lexical, syntactical, or grammatical, semantic, and so on, there exists a cloud of potential determinations. Language is placed in variation as soon as an atypical expression uproots it from its state as constant. In practice, this is what happens all the time. Style is therefore not to be regarded as a de facto deviation of a de jure standard, leading to a modification of language only by cumulative effect or syntagmatic mutation. It should rather be seen as the primary feature of all language, the becoming of language as such. Style can be the most natural thing in the world. It is nothing other than the procedure of continuous variation. This general pragmatics of style not only is presupposed by all other dimensions and distinctions of language, but also demystifies language by exposing it to the necessarily exterior sources of a style, non-linguistic elements such as gestures, sound waves, mnemonic technologies that all participate in the same continuum. Instead of being an artificial ornament, style determines the very economy of language, and as a total energetic investment is the only thing to justify our belief in the world. If a writer is easily distinguished through the style in which they actively manipulate the potential of language, it doesn't therefore follow that other language practitioners abide by the laws of linguistics. Just as constant is not opposed to variable, so too there are no strictly personal statements or enunciations, as if public language were the mere environment or background of private literary concerns. From the point of view of a generalized stylistics, every style is already a composite of languages, or rather a heterogenesis of language itself. The actual writer and the virtual linguistic community, both of them real, are pieces of a collective assemblage, agencement, of enunciation. Style designates agency in the use of language, in other words, but this agency does not belong to an author, but to the world it expresses. Instead of an intention, style has a thrust. It is the illocutionary force of an utterance, the vector that directs what to say next. As Gabriel Tarde says, the first act of language is a command. The word has not begun by being exchanged. It was given at the beginning as a command, that is, a kind of action of priestly or monarchic function, eminently authoritarian. We like to think that language serves the communication of stable meaning between subjects, but in order to achieve this, every act of language first needs to effectively perform this communicative vocation. Language acquires its meaning in the effects of its use, not in being predicable of an individual author. Instead of asking whose style, we should therefore ask which world it belongs to. Saying that there is no such thing as an individual style is not to deny that language is always already divided by its different uses and users. On the one hand, style is inattributable and open is an inattributable and open potential of repetition. We all iterate the same language to some degree of perfection, that is, according to some form or rule of norm. If language always seems to presuppose itself, if we cannot assign it a non-linguistic point of departure, it is because language does not operate between something seen or felt and something said, but always goes from saying to saying. The first language, or rather the first determination of language, is not the trope or metaphor, but indirect discourse. There exists no first speaker who has seen, and then a second speaker who repeats, but only a second and a third speaker. On the other hand, repetition perfection is also the condition for change and the form of invention. Repetition is the power of language, and far from being explicable in negative fashion by some default on the part of nominal concepts, essence, rule, or law, SVT, it implies an always excessive idea of poetry. In the use of language, everyone is, in principle, an artist, and in art, style overflows general rule. Indirect discourse means that there are all manner of voices in a voice, such that each of these voices potentially constitutes its own singular use of language. When Marcel Proust states that there are only so many rules as there are artists, he is rehearsing anti-academic claims made by Giordano Bruno, who argued that poetry is not born of the rule except by the merest chance, but that the rules derive from the poetry. For that reason, there are as many genres and species of true rules as there are of true poets. Rather than increasing inconsistency or manneredness, in other words, each manner is here understood as a sectioning of language or a plane of composition made up not of invariable or obligatory rules, but of optional rules that ceaselessly vary with the variation itself, as in a game in which each move changes the rules. Ariad, if you'd like to read.
If there is nonetheless an economy to this game, this is because there are two kinds of entropic forces that block the poetic becoming of language. Quotes, homogeneous language, or conversely, a heterogeneity so great that it becomes indifferent, gratuitous, and nothing definite passes between its poles. End quotes. Again, what matters is that style is not individual as opposed to collective, but that there is no moment to which its development can be pinned. A manner is never only individual, but precisely because it is what individualizes the open whole of language as such. This means that rather than the homogeneity of general discourse and the heterogeneity of individual speech, quote, between the main and the subordinate clause, there should be a tension, a kind of zigzagging, end quote. However, not every style or manner has the same power of asserting itself and communicating its world. In place of the classical mereology of individual mannerisms and general style, Deleuze and Guattari introduced a new duality that lies at the heart of their investigation of the conditions for literature. Major and minor. They write, quote, to not qualify different languages, but rather two usages or functions of language, end quote. A major language is a homogenized, centralized, standardized, and ultimately redundant language, because all it does is effectuate its own conditions of possibility. It has the form of a general indirect discourse in which the statements of the one are the enunciations of the other with no tension or confusion between them. I think, therefore I am. The utterer of the sentence, the determining I, is the same as the subject of the statement, the determined me. Everyone repeats the others, writing or speaking through others and following others. At the same time, the deviations in repetition constitute the various subject positions, each with their own recognizable manner of enunciation. Man or woman, urban or provincial, national or foreign, human or comp, funny, made up of order words. A major language thus reduces language to an exchange of information that serves the control of our typical behavior. It is the classical and classifying language of power, pouvoir. The unity of language is fundamentally political, because it is the main medium for the stabilization and unification of a historical people and its territory. This understanding of the major use of language raises the question where language comes from, or how one could challenge the rigidity of a system without setting up an equally inflexible alternative. After all, if all discourse is indirect, it follows that, quote, there is no mother tongue, only a power takeover by dominant language, end quote. In contrast with a major language, although not in opposition to it, is a minor language made up of varying powers, puissances of becoming. A minor language is not a generally recognizable idiolect or dialect belonging to a small and powerless group of people. Rather, it is bilingual by nature. Like an unstable tonality in music, it is minor in the sense that it sets the major language adrift in a kind of free, indirect speech. Both the particular and the general use are internalized by a third mode of use that acts as their tensor and defines their becoming. Neither accidental nor necessary, a minor language is a secret language, precisely because it is continually engendered from its own manner. Quotes, at the limit, a great writer draws his strength from a mute and unknown minority that belongs only to him. End quotes. Far from being abnormal, every style is abnormal to the extent that it has both major and minor aspects. This mode is anomalous. It indicates not a divergence from some group norm or a lack of coherence, but their cutting edge, the edge of deterritorialization of the group itself. The subject positions blur in a cloud of possibilities and become expressive of an incomplete world, a world that has lost the referential system between words and things. Do you want me to continue or someone else wants to go?
I'm down to read a little bit.
Okay.
I'm actually starting to see some correlations in this text and Moby Dick, so that's very weird, but awesome. All right. Deleuze frequently cites Proust's claim that a literary style is like a foreign language within a language. It replicates less in the mode of an organism than in the mode of a virus, that is, as parasitical surplus, since it is always based on an earlier style but breaking with it. In the poetic use of a major language, the becoming minor of language is therefore a question not of re-territorializing oneself on a dialect or a patois, but of deterritorializing the major language. A minor language consists of the attempt to conquer one's own major language, the language that warrants an author, in order to delineate in it as yet unknown minor languages. Following Marino, it is acquired through a particularly mannered use of language's potential, a repetition of a higher, in the sense of a more perverse rather than more true, use of perfection. No longer recognizable as an established art form, it is a self-potentializing repetition of the language that everybody speaks. A literary style is therefore managing to stammer in your own language. In stuttering from est to e, everything shifts. Instead of a formal or superficial repetition that stabilizes its content, it involves a syntax in the process of becoming. While fallible insofar as the work is not yet done but the maker no longer knows what to add, a new syntax is a creation that resists the thrust of the major style by drawing on exchanges between content and expression that verge on asyntactical. Whether it is by way of nonsense and invention, taking language to its physical limits, Artaud, or by whittling away all metaphorical guise, Kafka, Beckett, Deleuze and Guattari never cease to emphasize that the stuttering is that of an effective and intensive language, and no longer an affection of the one who speaks. To stutter is to resist the behaviorism of language and cut out a possible world from within language itself. Its radical novelty does not lie in its unrecognizable or illegitimate use of language, but in making language itself vibrate to the point of it becoming unrecognizable in turn. In a far from equilibrium manner, style then becomes non-style. Stripped of the grandeur of representation, words no longer signify what they used to. Their inchoate consistency now appears as open-ended sequence of gestures, as a body language or living and expressive material that speaks for itself and has no need of being put into a form. By revealing the habitual subject positions to be only the most easily recognizable forms of a multiplicitous potential, or, in other words, by destabilizing language and making it slip between manners, a literary style pries open the interstices in our established mode of writing and speaking. At the limit, it is like a polyphony of expressing subjects and modulation of statements, and thus constitutes the madness of language, its delirium. Asyntactic, agrammatical, the moment when language is no longer defined by what it says, even less by what makes it a signifying thing, but by what causes it to move, to flow, to explode, desire. For literature is like schizophrenia. a process, and not a goal. It is in this sense that in Kafka, Toward a Minor Literature, Deleuze and Guattari refer to Kafka's strategy as mannerist. In a letter to Max Brod, Kafka explains how, in Prague at the time of the breakdown of the Habsburg Empire, it is impossible for a Jewish writer to speak in German, impossible for him to speak in Czech, and yet impossible not to write. He has no choice but to develop a new style, a new language. But how could one sustain anti-canonical stands without transforming them into new canons? Unlike authors such as Gustav Meyrink and many others, including Max Brod himself, who are representatives of the symbolic and allegorical mannerism of the Prague school, which aimed at a symbolic reterritorialization in German through hidden signifiers based on archetypes, Kabbalah, and alchemy, Kafka resists the bifurcation of symbol and natural language, preferring a mannerism of sobriety or stretching within the German language that is all the more deterritorializing. Despite its political immediacy and its revolutionary potential, a minor literature is nothing spectacular. The creator is the opposite of an avant-garde revolutionary all set on changing the world starting from his own genius. Rather, he creates by becoming imperceptible in the heteropoiesis of a new collective assemblage of enunciation. Literature confronts us with a repetition of language in which the collective subject of enunciation is very different from the official enunciation of a people or of national consciousness. The former exists only in Latin or virtual state, the anonymous murmur of the fourth person singular, a term that Deleuze and Guattari adopt from Lawrence Ferlinghetti, that cannot be located in the civil and juridical language of statutes and laws, the paper language of bureaucracy, or the technocratic language of administrators and entrepreneurs. In particular, Kafka's sobriety, closely related to what Barthes will call the degree zero of modernist writing, lies in his doing away with metaphor understood as carrying over an original meaning. Gregor Samsa's Becoming Beetle, for example, is an intensive metamorphosis or static deformation, a playful slowing down of language about which there is nothing sensational. Metamorphosis is the contrary to metaphor. There is no longer any proper sense or figurative sense, but only a distribution of states that is part of the range of the word. The thing and other things are no longer anything but intensities overrun by deterritorialized sound or words that are following their line of escape. It is no longer a question of resemblance, even less a question of simple wordplay. There is no longer man or animal, since each deterritorializes the other, in a conjunction of flux, in a continuum of reversible intensities. The animal does not speak like a man, but pulls from the language tonalities lacking in signification. The words themselves are not like animals, but in their own way climb about, bark and roam about, being properly linguistic dogs, insects, or mice. To make the sequences vibrate, to open the word onto unexpected internal intensities, in short, an asignifying intensive utilization of language. Mannerism uses language in such a way that it places writing into variation and moves it into a multiplicity of intensities out of which order words will always be stabilized, but only secondarily. A mannerism of sobriety is a matter of finding passwords beneath other words, words that pass, words that are components of passage, whereas order words mark stoppages or organized, stratified compositions. Here, mannerism has nothing to do with a particularly affected use of language, but with a use that makes language partake of an animal continuum. Kafkaesque is not an adjective but an adverb. Language is pushed into intensive or unformed expressions that cannot be attributed to culture at large or even to an individual author, but rather call into being new collective assemblages of enunciation, new schizophrenic or animal manners of using language that carry within them the seeds of a real revolution. It is no longer the subject of the statement who is a dog with the subject of the enunciation remaining like a man, it is no longer the subject of enunciation who is like a beetle, the subject of the statement remaining a man. Rather, there is a circuit of states that forms a mutual becoming in the heart of a necessarily multiple or collective assemblage. Ultimately, this aesthetic strategy of heightening language is essential to a politics in which the majority is always that of an abstract standard held up by nobody in particular, hence its redundancy, and the minor details the becoming of everybody. The enunciative procedure of free indirect writing is to resist the conspiracy of imitators that blocks the condition for literary creation and foster the invention of another potential community, to forge the means for another consciousness and another sensibility. If it is through the order words of a major language that the people as subject can become a subjected people, a minor use shows how it already bears in its fragmented body the seeds of a people to come. This does not mean that writing consists of re-territorializing the literary machine on a general culture reduced to a subcompartment of the political unconscious. On the contrary, writing calls for the deterritorialization of the collective enunciation so as to produce an expression of force or linguistic being in veritable effective power relations with real political consequences. Far from being merely symbolic, a literary mannerism of sobriety gives readers, speakers, and hearers a way of understanding life together according to their own desires and interests, and a different way of affecting one another through speech. That was a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you.
There was something there earlier in the section that Ariad was reading. It made me think.
Black.
Huh? Oh yeah.
Yeah, tie this to Melville and Moby Dick for us.
Definitely. Well, so this is just the little part that I wrote. There's something mystical in the endless potential of language that mirrors nature's power of diversity, something mannerism attempts to get a snapshot of, and there is a terror and beauty in this, something sublime, which that definitely might not be clear, but it's Melville actually quotes Proust at some point, which is or no, sorry, some secondary peer-reviewed article quotes Proust to make sense of Melville, in kind of a similar way that this book quotes Proust to discuss mannerism. But that idea that they were talking about, where there's like two antithetical things that are coexisting, like they're not opposed to each other, but they're coexisting, is something that gets talked about a little bit in relation to Melville, specifically in relation to how whales see. And this was something that Melville was like weirdly obsessed with, or actually, I wouldn't say weirdly because I'm just as obsessed with it, but he'll talk about how whales, the way that they perceive the world is two different pictures, two distinct pictures on each side of each other, separated by like vast darkness in the middle, right? Because each of the whale's eyes is on each side of it, which is, and Melville will talk about this being different from how humans see the world, where our line of vision and line of sight is unified and in one direction. I'm a little too exhausted to bring this together right now, but yeah, I might do a mannerist reading of Moby Dick for my dissertation now. I don't know.
Make that a chapter.
Yeah, it might be a paragraph or a chapter. Or
Mannerism and the huge whale.
Yeah.
the
But
mannerism of
now
fat
it has me
cocks.
looking of mannerism. Like mannerism isn't necessarily like we've talked before about like oh, mannerism pushes against um the what came before, and then we said, well, it doesn't really push against, it incorporates what came before and then extends it. And now it has me thinking, well, it allows what came before and the new form to coexist side by side. And the haters of
Mm.
mannerism hate that because there is something beautiful and terrifying in it. So,
Well, I'm
Like
surprised.
your the way your conception, you have a conception of space with your eyes looking forward, and the whale has a different conception of space, and they both coexist.
yep, yep.
Yeah. And I was just thinking what you could look at in Melville is how he, if you look at the people writing before him, I think it's around 1850 he writes Moby Dick, maybe 51 or 57. But if you think about the language that he's using and how it's different from the authors in the generation before, and what hit me in this was two things. One was it's again Giambattista Vico's theory of ricorso, where the language changes in a three-phase model. And the other thing that hit me is like what he's saying is right. Like every author trying to write a book is basically they create their own new language to communicate their conception of space or their reality to other people. And what it made me think of, like he used the example of Kafka, and it's very interesting to say he's Kafka's like kind of you could say he's in the final Kafka's like in the final phase. He's really a transitional character between what came before modernity and modernity that's about to arrive. And he's kind of doing this vulgar thing where he's getting rid of metaphor. And then it made me think of Murakami, an author that I'm pretty familiar with, because when Murakami started writing, he actually like translated the first couple of chapters of the first work that he wrote into English. Then he translated it back into Japanese, and he started writing in this particular kind of very simple, pared back, unadorned Japanese style. And it's a little bit like when you think of people like Raymond Chandler, Raymond Carver, what they call kitchen sink realism, and it's a kind of minimalist sort of style. So every author is kind of searching for a new language to express what they're trying to say.
I was going to say, I'm surprised he hasn't brought this up yet. But since we're on the topic of the Luds, the way that he's making Mannerism to be this movement that carries over elements from the past and repeats them, but not necessarily to the T of what it incorporates, but brings in new additions and renovates what came before in a way that's retains it. That's sort of the way that Deleuze characterizes the history of philosophy. If you've noticed, like in the way that he calls concepts, arrows thrown into the future that different philosophers pick up, refine, and then throw again in their turn, like a recasting, like an eternal return of recasting in a sense, right? And that's that sounds a lot like what he's making Mannerism to be here.
Definitely.
What do you think, Jay?
Can you kind of rephrase that or put that again?
The way that he's hashing out
Like the
Mannerism.
arrow, like the arrows. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with that term ricorso,
Recurso.
and yeah, ricorso in language. It's like it's an old theory from someone called an Italian thinker called Vico, and a lot of people influenced it. People like Adorno, actually, in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. But you have this. He slightly references it here, where there's like a kind of original language that is like where you say this is that, and like there's no subject object split. There's like kind of God or an unacknowledged legislator, and you have word as sign, and this is described as poetic or hieroglyphic language, right? And it's concrete, not abstract. Then you have the next phase of language, which he describes as heroic or noble, and it's basically sort of it's produced by an intellectual elite, a culturally ascendant language. It's kind of the language of the academy. Only thinking can express it, and it's where you have this is put for that. Highly stylized and formal. You have the subject object separation, and abstraction becomes possible under this language form. And then you have the final phase, the third phase. It's literally vulgar or demotic, like it means sort of common of the people. There's the clear separation of subject and object is the starting point, and subject exposes itself in sense experience to the impact of an objective world. The objective world is the order of nature, reaction against the transcendentalism of a second phase. And all religious questions are unmeaning in this third phase. Nothing exists in the intellect that has not existed in the senses. It's inductive, and it's no longer possible to separate the observer from what he observes. The observer had to become an observed object too. So this is that third kind of vulgar phase, like where like you can think of capitalist realism, or in the earlier times, I think of it with there's a period called the New Objectivity over in Germany and Europe. The Germans call it Neusachlichkeit. It's like a kind of interwar art period where it's kind of dark and gloomy, but what they're painting and what they're talking about in the literature, what is really there is what we are really seeing. And you can think of it in capitalist realism as well. But yeah, you go through these three phases, and then there is a ricorso, a return back to the first phase. And the reason why is this is kind of maybe a little bit symbolism and archetypal, maybe a little bit of anthropology, but it's to keep presenting us with a mode of language that we cannot lose sight of. And in the third phase, you have avoidance of the figurative. So you could think of how classicist architecture keeps returning is one of the best examples. And it keeps alive the metaphorical use of language and associated habits of thinking. I was just reading to you guys from my own notes on that theory.
Oh, okay.
This is but like it really hits on that, like the language sort of goes in this kind of three-phase evolution, and then it has a return. But obviously the return is always different. It's not a return back to
The same.
back to the same. But it's to keep trying to present us with these same, I don't know, like modes of, well, yeah. Yeah, but I felt that's sort of where it's going with Kafka. Like, and he also mentions there is no longer any proper sense or figurative sense. So in that vulgar phase, there is no figurative. Only a distribution of states that is part of the range of the word. The thing and the other things are no longer anything but intensities overrun by deterritorialized sounder words that are following their line of escape. It is no longer a question of resemblance, even less a question of simple wordplay. It strikes me as, it immediately hits me with that idea of ricorso.